Hello and welcome to Module 5. We'll be talking about the early schools of psychology in America, and this chapter focuses on a small but very relevant part of the early schools of psychology. It is much less all-encompassing than some other texts are, but this gives you a really good inclination of how the American schools derived from the European schools, and it maintains continuity in that way. So it does a good job of what it's doing, and it'll also go along with what we've been talking about so far. We'll be talking about a guy named Edward Bradford Titchener, and he was around somewhere in the late 1860s, and he did a really good job of developing a school in America based on what he learned from Wundt back in Europe. He began at Cornell University, and he was really on the leading edge of experimental psychology in that he started to use a scientific process to take a look at what he wanted to experiment with, and because of that, he came up with his school called structuralism. There is a kind of a debate between the structuralists, which he was one of, and the functionalists, which is a lot of other people. He brought the idea that mental processes could be objectively measured. With regard to experimental psychology, there were labs popping up just about everywhere. The deal was that they were talking about the pure practice of science, which is what most scientists wanted to talk about, versus the practical aspects of psychology or of science, which is what the psychologists wanted to talk about. You see, the scientists said, we're not really concerned about how this all really works in the world. We just want to test it and make sure that it does work and then move on. It's kind of like how you learned math in high school, where you would learn how to do the problems, derive formulas, and do statistics and learn geometry, but there was really no end to it. It was just you learned it to learn how to do it. And that's how the scientists kind of looked at it. Then there was a practical aspect, which the psychologists looked at. They wanted to know, okay, fine, we're going to learn all this stuff, but we want to be able to put it into good use. And that was kind of the difference between science as being pure and science as being practical. That has also been a never-ending issue with psychology as a soft science. They don't want. It's interesting that the psychologists wanted to take a look at the practical aspects of stuff, how it really applied to the world, and it got called a soft science because of that. Well, not only that, but because it was hard to observe some mental processes, except for just through the evidence that we saw in the experimental design. But Mr. Cattell said, well, geez, we know that science has been around for a little while at least, and psychology is brand new, so I'll bet you it's going to be the science of the 20th century. Because of what had happened in Europe and Titchener's idea of psychology, the scientific attitude spread throughout the labs of the country, in the psychological labs. Science was the preferred method of observing the mind, which was interesting to them because they couldn't see anything except for the evidence of it. We did read about the earlier people who decided that cutting open brains was a good way to look at the mind, and bloodletting back in the Dark Ages was used, but not so practical for looking at the actual mind. And there is a distinction between mind versus brain. The mind is the processes. That's the psychological part of the mind. It's the processes, it's the feelings, it's the thoughts. And the brain is the actual tissue and the actual neurons that we take a look at. And that's kind of the difference between the mind and the brain. And the interesting thing about what Titchener wanted to do was he wanted to put science where science was not possible, according to his critics. The science was not possible in psychology because it was not observable. You couldn't see psychology, you couldn't taste it, you couldn't hear it, you couldn't feel it. And the problem with Titchener in that is that he saw that there was lots of evidence for it. He just had to figure out how to take a look at it. Titchener had a really good idea of psychology as far as he was concerned, and when he developed his structuralist school, it was going fine. But after he died, it kind of stalled, mostly because he wasn't around anymore to defend it, and the students weren't able to. And so it was kind of more open for criticism by the functionalists and the behavioralists. They were able to more freely express their opinions on the matter, and the deal with the behaviorists and the functionalists being yucky was that they stopped caring so much about the mental processes as far as the structure of the mind, and they just wanted to see what you could observe, and that was good enough for them. They didn't care really how it happened as much as that it did happen. So the school of structuralism came up when we're talking about the idea of the mind versus the consciousness. To Titchener, the mind was the sum total of all the processes, the sum experience of everything. And the consciousness was more or less the present, what is observable by the person at a particular time. And because of this, he said something to the effect of, we really can't observe the same consciousness twice. And everybody kind of jumped on that to say, well, geez, if you can't experience the same consciousness twice, how can this be objectable? How can it be objective? How can we take a look at this from a standpoint that we can repeat these results, we can test them on many different people and expect to get the same results, when the fact of the matter is they're really not sure how you can get the same result, or excuse me, how you can get different result from seeing the same stimulus. The way that was explained was through the ideas that govern structuralism, which is identifying, discovering, and determining. They wanted to identify the structure of the consciousness, first by identifying its elements. Okay, step one. Then they took a look to see how they were grouped and arranged, how these elements were, and then they determined the causes of the particular arrangements of elements. You know, like why are they arranged this way, why now, and why not some other arrangement? And that the answers to those questions were really as easy as saying why are two people the same? You know, why do we experience the same thing differently twice? All that stuff that goes into it is a matter of talking about the differences between everybody. And structuralism also did seek to connect psychology and physiology. They wanted to see how the mind and the body work together. And as is customary, we use introspection for this kind of stuff when we're talking about how we are structured. And the main idea is observing. We need to observe what is going on when we are thinking about something from a structural standpoint. And that involves training, 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 training. As much training as you can possibly give to somebody. You have to train them how to take a look at what's going on in their mental processes without interrupting those processes, which seems impossible, but they seem to think that they can get away with it. And the problem with that is that you have to have honest attention to your processes. You can't change them, you can't adapt them, you cannot manipulate them. You have to leave them as they are and reflect on them, or else you're going to get some faulty answers. And that's one of the big criticisms of structuralism is that, geez, how can you be sure that what you're getting is an actual reflection of what's going on versus what the trainers want to tell you they are observing? And the critics are going to say, ahem, what about introspection being subjective? What about observing the same stimulus and seeing a different result? And what about stimulus error? Well, Titchener said that introspection is indeed subjective only in so much as you train your listeners or your observers. Um, the same stimulus, different result issue is explained by the fact that we are taking a look at how this is structured, and it might take a bunch of trials where we have differences in what we observe based on the same stimulus. And furthermore, he trained people to avoid the stimulus error, as he coined it, by observing what something was comprised of versus looking at the whole. For example, in the book, you have a situation where somebody puts a book down in front of you and you say that's a book. And Titchener would say, well, yeah, okay, you just engaged in a stimulus error where you observed the whole instead of the parts of the whole, which is what you're trying to look at. Um, the inverse of that is that when you're driving down the road and you see something with two headlights, a grill, and a bumper and a windshield flying at you, you don't have to think to yourself, well, geez, that has headlights, a bumper, a grill, and a windshield coming at me. You think, oh, it's a car. I should probably get out of the way. So he had to teach these people to undo what is normally taught just by conceptualizing certain objects as such based on their principal parts. Titchener focused a lot on elements of consciousness like sensations, images, and feelings. And we talk mostly about sensations here because that's what Titchener was mostly concerned with. And he had four different attributes for each type of um, attribute. He had quality, intensity, clearness, and duration. And you can read about what those are, but the one that he focused on mostly was quality, which gave things the kind of like their characteristics. It talked a lot about what things looked like, felt like, tasted like, and they were not necessarily the same thing as comparing intensities, which would be, comparing bright or dim, loud or soft, or the clearness of it, because if you're observing it, then it is said to be clear. And so he focused mostly on quality because it gave a little more of a representation of something as a single attribute rather than including intensity and duration and intensity. Or excuse me, intensity, clearness, and duration. And of course, in keeping with the scientific times, he came up with a periodic table which included 11,600 auditory stimuli that could be observed and 32,820 visual stimuli that could be observed. And to answer the question why, it's mostly because he needed to qualify these things and quantify them in a certain realm to be able to make it more of a science because that's what was going on. And that was the biggest criticism is that it wasn't a science. So we figured if he could make a direct comparison between a known scientific table and a psychological table, then maybe it would gain more validity as a science. An interesting character in all this is Margaret Floy Washburn. She was a student of Titchener who engaged in analogous introspection. What she was able to do was take a look at animal behavior and compare that behavior to what the observers might think would be going on, and in a way was able to do some introspection based on what was going on in the animals. And she was the first person to really do this. And although Titchener really didn't like, maybe he liked it, but he didn't engage in the psychology of animals. So he really didn't go along with doing it himself. But when she did it, it seemed to be okay. He was impressed by it and actually sent her work over to Wundt to be published in their journal. Strangely, Titchener was not a fan of the APA because it was not scientific enough. It allowed non-scientists in, and it didn't focus mostly on science, which is interesting as far as what he was doing, anyways. So he develops his own organization called the Experimentalists. My best guess, and this is off the record, is that he did it because he thought he was better than everybody else and wanted to develop his own type of organization, which, by the way, did not allow women, despite the fact that he basically endorsed a woman and her work. But I think what it said something in there. Let me take a look if I can find it. Here it is. Attendance was by invitation only, and only men were permitted. Titchener wanted it that way because he felt that the presence of women would harm the kind of frank discussion that he wanted to have among laboratory men. Yeah, it was kind of slimy, I'd say. But don't worry, after he croaked, they allowed women in and all was well again in that realm. Among his other attributes, Titchener came up with what are called the manuals, more formally, Experimental Psychology, a manual of laboratory practice. And there is basically a manual on how to do qualitative and quantitative experiments, and it is said to be his greatest contribution to American psychology. It was interesting. Reading between the lines, they really served to protect his students from the inept experimentalist instructors. Um, more or less, it says that he really didn't trust how everybody else was teaching it, and he thought he was superior, so it may as well be he who teaches everybody. And he did that through his manuals. In contrast to Titchener's structuralism came functionalism, which was really interesting because it came out of things from Darwin, and it is actually thought of to be the first uniquely American school of psychology, although that is still kind of up in the air, mostly because it seems like it was an offshoot of some European work. However, functionalism is much broader in concept and method than structuralism was, in that it encompassed a greater array of ideas that were more likely to be able to be put into practice rather than engaging in a bunch of introspection and doing a bunch of training. It mostly focused on how the consciousness functioned rather than the structure of it. So it was seemingly more practical, yet it really discounted the validity of the underlying issues in the consciousness. And from the idea that there were a lot of functions that were widely available that were discounted actually by the structuralists was the idea that there were some functions that happened consciously that seemed to be isolated and actually were not, and they were seen to be as another starting point for studying the mind in the fact that you have this seemingly short type of process, and in reality, it's backed by a lot of processes before it and then a lot of processes afterwards. So, what you actually observe is a very short string in what is to be a lot of conscious practice. And the main conceptions of functionalism include the mental operations of non-mental, or excuse me, and not mental elements, and it also looked at the fundamental utilities of consciousness and the physical plus the mental. The mental operations and not mental elements is exactly the difference between the structuralist versus the functionalist. Whereas the structuralists look at the elements behind everything, behind consciousness. The functionalist looked at the mental operations, what was actually going on, rather than what was underlying it. The second point takes a look at the fundamental utilities of consciousness. That is, how can you use consciousness in order to change, in order to adapt? And that was a huge idea for the functionalists because, after all, they were looking at the function or the usefulness of consciousness. And it also looked at the coupling between the physical and mental aspects of the body, or physical and psychological, or also physiological versus psychological. And that seemed to be one of the big points for a lot of early schools in looking at how the mind and body went together, because up until then it seemed like you could study one or the other and there wasn't a real way to connect the two. And the tiebreaker is Wordsworth in his dynamic psychology. He was the midline between the structuralists and the behavioralists. Uh, his argument was that psychology didn't sprout from any sort of definition or method, but more or less from a question, which is actually is what the scientific process is based on, is the idea of question. You look at the question, then you have a tendency to answer from it, unless of course you're doing inductive research, then not. But they weren't doing it this way. They were looking for answers to questions more than anything else. And Wordsworth looked at the causal relationships in the mind, or in short, the dynamics. He wanted to know how things went together and how that interaction went on to change things. And he looked mostly at the motivation as the evidence for this causal relationship. He says if one idea or one aspect of the mind causes another and you act on it, then that must be motivating something. So he wanted to take a look at how one was motivated by his mental processes. And in another way, he looked at the stimulus response system, which is both looked at by the structuralists and functionalists, but he interjected organismic variables. He wanted to take a look at how the individual perceiving what was going on had some kind of bearing on what the response was. In short, he was questioning the idea that trainers could be 100% consistent, but that was really no question because the structuralists knew it. That was only a criticism of the functionalists. Um, but what he did was he included it to identify the issue that the response was mitigated by organismic type observations, and the idea that the functionalists wanted to include that and point it out. So he made it okay for the structuralist to admit that there is some kind of variable in the observer, and then that would also allow the functionalist to point out the fact that there is that same issue. So he was really a moderator between those two ideas. And that same idea also kind of put a clamor on the idea that you could have a stimulus that would elicit a different response on the same occasion. Or simply put, you can have the same response to, or excuse me, different responses to the same stimulus.